Just want to share that very interesting that if you speak to people in the industry, for the past couple of years, probably one of the top skill set that people are looking for is that the ability for the CFO to do fundraising, right? Recently, it has moved from fundraising to fundraising plus control. Even I've met people with like 5-6 strong controls, right? I think the role of a finance leader is ever evolving, yet critical, right? So if you do join a startup, be ready to be agile, adaptable, and I think more importantly, embrace the multiple hats that you're wearing.
Hi folks, so welcome back to On Call with Insignia, where we go on call with leaders innovating the future of Southeast Asia's internet and digital economy, or as we like to call it, ASEAN Innovation. I'm your host, Paolo Aquino, and with us on this episode, on this call, we have the Chief Financial Officer and co-founder of Rainforest, none other than Jason Tan. So for those who are hearing about Rainforest for the first time, if you guys are familiar with the e-commerce aggregator space, they are very much in that industry, focusing a lot on Southeast Asia and the Asian market. But if you ask JJ, Jason here, and the other members of the team, I think they very much say that they are building a house of brands, really e-commerce house of brands, buying and building e-commerce brands of the future. So we're really happy to have Jason here on the show because we've had JJ on call with us 2 years ago, where he introduced the company and we got to learn a little bit more about how the company started. But eager to get not just an update from Jason, but also his perspective as CFO. It's not very often that we have finance leaders on the show as well, so really excited about that. So thanks, Jason, for coming on the show.
Thanks, Paulo. Thanks for having us. JJ spoke a lot about this session. I didn't realize it was 2 years ago right now. Yeah, happy to be here to share some of my thoughts.
And a little intro on Jason before we move right in is this is definitely not his first rodeo as CFO. Prior to Rainforest, he was CFO of Fave and OVO before that. And then before moving into the tech sector, he had quite a long career, more than a decade at CIMB, which eventually saw him become Director of Group Strategy and Strategic Investment. So definitely has that finance DNA, and eager to learn more from his perspective through this call. But for starters, I just wanted for you to share with our listeners what that shift was like. I mentioned just now that you had more than a decade career in banking. What made you decide to take that jump into startups and become a founder yourself? And what was the biggest challenge for you making that shift?
Yeah, thanks, Paulo. I think you're right. I spent the first 13 years of my career at, CIMB. I think spending most of my time doing M&A, corporate transactions, and fundraising. It provides me with a lot of fundamental skills, build a good foundation, network, and also stability. So moving across from such a relatively stable environment into a startup is indeed a big move. And the first startup that I joined was in Indonesia. And when I joined OVO, I was practically employee number 10 or 11, and as the founding CFO there. So what actually drove that decision? I think a couple of things: the opportunity to grow both in skill set and experience, perhaps greater autonomy, and also just to realize what else can I actually do and do myself as an individual. Definitely, there will be a lot of challenges. I think one of the main things is this mindset shift. As part of a bank, I always say that you are part of this mothership, that there is plenty of resources, plenty of buffers as well. Moving on to a startup, what you realize is that a lot of decisions that you make, a lot of actions that you take impacts the organization a lot more as compared to, say, a bank or a larger organization.
We have quite a number of finance professionals listening in. Would you also recommend that kind of trajectory based not just on yourself, but also what you've seen with your peers in other startups? Like, would you recommend that trajectory of going through that kind of stable environment first in banking before jumping into startups, or if they really see themselves working in a startup, to just jump right in?
I think yes and no. See, now I'm also getting a lot of fresh grads right now interviewing with us, and I applaud them for taking their decision because there's definitely, I would say, it's a different risk-reward paradigm. I do feel that if you join a startup, the learning curve is definitely steeper. Relatively, as I already mentioned, it's riskier from a career security perspective. But if I were to rewind 20 years or so, I would still prefer my route where you build your foundation in a probably more established environment. And when you're ready, I think you can take on more challenges and wear multiple hats and be a finance professional in a startup.
What is one thing that you took away from your banking days that you were really able to apply as you became like a finance leader in startups?
Yeah, I think it's interesting, right? So if you are part of a bank, a lot of time you will be taught to evaluate proposals, investments, and a certain set of criteria and rules. And I think I brought that across. But at the same time, you realize that you can't copy and paste everything that you learn because the pace is definitely faster in a startup. We do not have the luxury to perhaps do the same level of evaluation, the same level of approvals as compared to a bank. But what we will then do is to then decide on something, monitor and iterate if we need to. And I think that's one of the foundations that I mentioned about a bit earlier. Just need to tweak it for the requirements of the startup.
And I think that assessing opportunities is really the bread and butter of Rainforest's business model, actually. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later on. But first, I wanted to fast forward from your shift into tech startups to when you were, as we learned from JJ in that podcast 2 years ago, he spoke how he actually introduced you to him. So I wanted to also get your perspective on that story. What was that like, and what made you decide to join Rainforest?
That's an interesting one. I love this question actually. So I know of Insignia, obviously, although they did not invest in any of the previous startups that I was part of. Definitely we met through events and so. So one day I got an approach to ask if I was interested in joining something exciting. And I do believe that was the tagline sold to me then. I'll say, why not? It's a pretty much a no regret call. And that's when I was put together in a call together with JJ, some sort of blind dates for founders to the call. And that was just the beginning of a series of calls. And eventually I was also introduced to our third co-founder, Ola. And I think after speaking about 2 months, 3 months or so, we decided to put something on paper, sign it off. And that was the birth of Rainforest. Running a startup, it is really tough, right? And to have the right team, to have the right set of alignment in values, it's very important, especially amongst your co-founding team. And I am very grateful that I found that in my co-founders, both JJ and Ola. And I'm just glad that our journey has been great so far. I think about 2.5 years right now. Maybe I would also like to share a fun fact here. Where I started Rainforest, I was still at Jakarta, where I actually spent 12 years there. And I did not manage to meet any of them physically for the first 12 months of our operations. And it's pretty crazy to think that we did 3 rounds of fundraising during the time as well without me meeting my fellow co-founders physically.
That's pretty interesting. And certainly, I would say an experience that we've heard a lot on the show as well. Like a lot of co founders, especially companies that started in 2020, never actually met for 12 months or even up to 2 years before restrictions started to ease. And then they were finally able to meet in person. So, yeah, kudos to actually like pulling that off and raising that amount of money without having to really meet in person. I did want to ask, because Rainforest is an e-commerce, very much focused in the e-commerce sector, but you're two prior like companies were very much in the fintech space. So what was that transition like from a sort of an industry perspective? Was there anything from your prior experiences that you were able to bring into the sort of navigating the e-commerce space?
Yeah, I think you mentioned this a bit earlier, Paulo. I think buy and build it's always been there in the playbook. So when I learned about this opportunity to apply this strategy on good e-commerce brands, I pretty much jumped at it. Obviously, you're right. I think my previous experiences were probably more tilted towards fintech. But evaluating good brands to buy, it's similar to assets that I've done in my previous life. So that's what I see the similarity. And I've also touched about having the right people, complementary skills. So those ingredients were there. And so it didn't really take me a lot to sign up to this.
But now I wanted to ask a question I've been asking all of our guests for season 5 is the 3 numbers question, as I call it. So how would you describe the impact that you bring to Rainforest in 3 numbers? And I think this will be an opportunity for our listeners to really get a grasp of what being a finance leader, particularly in this kind of company, looks like.
Yeah, I think in the span of about 2.5 years, we're now acquired 16 e-commerce brands and focusing on parenting and kids categories. We have recently recorded our first ever profitable quarter. So that's one of the great achievements for Rainforest. And I think so far we have been focusing a lot on the Amazon-based assets. So one of the things that we are shifting our strategy or expanding our strategy to be exact is to look at non-Amazon brands as well and bigger assets for acquisition. In terms of numbers, I think looking back 2.5 years, growing from the three of us to now close to 100-man strong team across more than 50 countries, I think that's another probably numbers I would also like to share, because Rainforest is all about its people as well. And to me, building a remote first and such international team is, to me, it's one of the achievements of Rainforest. So that's probably another one of the numbers that I would like to share.
Yeah, so 16 brands, more than 100 people at Rainforest over the past 2.5 years. And I think you guys are still growing that team, right? For those listening who are interested to explore careers with them, definitely reach out. We'll leave a link in the podcast description. And we'll also talk a little bit more later on about your approach to building out the team within Rainforest, specifically the finance function. Stay tuned for that. But first, I wanted to ask, how has your own role or leadership approach evolved since you joined Rainforest? Is there anything, and we touched on this a little bit earlier, is there anything you've had to let go of or unlearn from your previous CFO tenures?
So Rainforest was born during the COVID era. Being a remote first and pretty international team, we would have to change the way we communicate, whether it's virtual or otherwise. That is, to me, one of the biggest challenge that we face. So while the mode of communication might have changed because of the lack of physical one-on-ones, I think the basis of communication, the basis of the importance of building trust stays the same. So that is one of the challenge, one of the difference I need to learn better, because building trust is quite different virtually versus physically. So that is probably one of the, I guess, the biggest challenge that we face. At Rainforest as well, I think to build trust, we do over-index a lot on being open, being clear and concise in our communication. So one example that I can share is our OKR platform is open all at Rainforest. You can track the CEO's achievements of the OKRs, my OKRs, how have I achieved it, and so on. Also, I think a lot has been spoken and written about working from home, working remote, but I do feel that one of the things that I've learned over the past 2.5 years is that there's also a downside of working from home. For example, I can share that working from home obviously is not for everyone. What I've realized is new joiners, especially new joiners into the workforce, whether they are fresh grad, they actually do prefer a lot more time, face-to-face time with the teammates, because being new, they do feel that those support comes better face-to-face as compared to virtually. Right. So that's one thing that I've always reminded our managers to spend more effort in guiding the new joiners.
Yeah, no, interesting practices that you mentioned. I really like what you talked about, the OKR platform being open to everybody in the organization, and also that insight about new joiners really wanting also that in-person experience as well. Although there is that convenience with being remote. I now wanted to shift gears and talk a little bit about the business that Rainforest is doing. And we've mentioned it several times so far that we really find, acquire, and then support e-commerce brands and businesses as you build this house of brands. And I would say that the role of the CFO in this particular type of business is a little bit more pronounced maybe than other types of businesses. So maybe you could elaborate a little bit more on that, like how the business model of Rainforest impacts particularly your role as CFO.
Yeah, so as part of my role at Rainforest, I lead acquisitions as well. And I think it's important to also highlight that acquisition is just means to building up the portfolio. What's equally or even more important is how do we build a brand post-acquisition to realize its potential. And in my role, I do have a wide and holistic view on everything from fundraising to the numbers, to the forecast, and through acquisitions as well. Obviously, they all are interlinked. And I think having this holistic view is important for me. It's important for Rainforest just because of the interconnectivity amongst all these functions.
Yeah, I really like what you mentioned about also having to pay attention to how the health of the cash flow of the brands post acquisition as well. Because obviously the acquisition is just the beginning for your business. And yeah, it doesn't really make sense if you just buy, but then they don't succeed afterwards. Have you noticed anything in terms of how you've had to grow these brands post acquisition in terms of, how much cash you've had to allocate and how much versus what you expected initially? Has there been any difference in terms of expectations versus reality on that?
Oh, definitely. So I think if you open up the portfolio, there will always be outperformers, the one that meet expectation, and similarly, there'll be underperformers as well. Be many factors to that. It could be anything from supply chain, could be pricing, could be competitors, so many things that can actually impact on the actual versus forecast. But what is actually more important for us is to create the team, is to create the foundation, is to create the tools, and for us to take action to build this brand towards its fullest potential. One example that we probably would look at is product development. So if a brand is already successful, the team will actually look at new opportunities to either improve the existing products. It could be as simple as introducing new colors, new sizes, or even adjacent products to actually leverage on the strength of the brand and ultimately grow the brand and profitability.
And then speaking of big picture, I wanted to also ask your views on the current landscape for building this kind of house of brands. I know JJ also did an interview with Tech in Asia recently that was published in one of their articles about how there's this shift moving from just focusing on acquisitions, which you mentioned, to really building up those foundations to help these brands grow. I wanted to ask, particularly since you lead acquisitions, how have the expectations evolved in terms of what entrepreneurs are looking at with what they can exit with? Are they a lot more eager these days, or are they a little bit more hesitant? Like, how have things changed?
Yeah, when we started Rainforest, we saw the introduction of many similar players. There were a lot of funds being raised. Relatively, fundraising was easier. Deadlines were available. I think media even doubt this frenzy as the modern day gold rush. I think fast forward 2 years, 2.5 years later, I think the situation has obviously there's a life cycle to the industry as well. We are seeing a couple of trends. I think number one, it's very clear it impacts many other industry and verticals as well. I think the availability of funds has tightened. I think that's one. You spoke about valuation expectation. I think that has also dropped. People are more willing to sell. People are more willing to talk to them. And thirdly, you're actually seeing more and more. In fact, there was a announcement this morning as well on what you see is that the mergers of aggregators. So previously, aggregators raised money to buy brands. Today, aggregators are merging with aggregators, right, to realize the fuller potential of cost synergies. For us, we have been very disciplined in our growth. We have been focusing a lot of optimizing our costs, optimizing our performance. And as I mentioned later, we are actually in a good position right now to make the next strategic moves to propel us to the next phase of growth.
Yeah, definitely a good time to be profitable if there's any time to be. And I wanted to move to another aspect of the business, which I think you've been really passionate about from our conversation so far, which is really the team and building that organization. And you talked about some strategic moves, considering moving out of Amazon brands and also really looking at more opportunities, especially in this kind of market, to acquire more brands within the sector you're targeting. How do you see that impacting the way the team or the organization is evolving?
Yeah, we have always been keen to automate as much as possible, especially in the finance function. So as the
Right.
organizations grow bigger, more complex, then the need to automate becomes even more important. So one of the major projects that we have undertaken since late last year was the introduction or integration of ERP into Rainforest. It's a monster of a task, as you could
Right.
imagine. But I'm so glad to share that we are at the tail end of the process, and this will just form a stronger platform for us, better from a finance function or the supply chain function, for us to operate our brands more optimally. I also do believe that building a team starts from hiring. Even until today, I will interview each and every of the joiners of Rainforest. Not so great for the interviewees because they have to go through an additional layer of interview. But I think it is very important, right? It doesn't guarantee 100% success. But I feel that it's good to at least share our vision, to share our values, and for me to gauge the alignment of the new joiners with our values that we hold tightly here at Rainforest.
Like, thematically speaking, is there a particular kind of question that you ask, like in these interviews, to really suss out that kind of alignment for new joiners?
I think one of the core values that we have is trying to suss out how deep the sense of ownership is, right? I typically will ask one or two examples that the interviewee can share with me. that they will be able to demonstrate the sense of ownership. It could be anything from high school, from house, from their career, and so on. So you will be able to see and gauge this person's sense of ownership.
And I wanted to zoom into the finance function specifically, and maybe this would be particularly useful for especially early stage CEOs out there or even finance leaders out there who are thinking about how to build out their startup's finance function. What has your approach been to doing that at Rainforest?
I think every startup is different. Every level, I think we need to look at what is the priority. So today, for example, you would want to start with the control function. And I think control function is very important no matter how big or small the organization is. Then you probably need to move on a bit more to the future, the forecasting and the monitoring. And then if it really grows bigger than that, then there is also the tax, the treasury function that one should actually be putting a lot more effort on. So there are multiple layers to that. And obviously, if you consider fundraising as part of finance function as well, that's one of the non-negotiables from the beginning, right? So I think you can split finance function into all those different categories.
I really appreciate what you mentioned about the control function being really foundational, regardless of the stage. And I think a lot more companies are realizing that now. And so I think people who specialize in that kind of those kinds of roles are very much in demand all the more these days. I wanted to also ask about performance management, and I know I think this is a pretty challenging question for a lot of leaders, regardless of what kind of organization that they're in, because it's something that's always evolving, right? But what has been your own learnings from this experience of doing performance management, especially for an organization that is remote, operates across different countries? Yeah, what has been your learnings or take on that?
Yeah, I think number one is to be open and to be clear. So I've already shared early on in this
The
call.
OKR platform.
Yeah, we do have an OKR platform. It's public. Everyone can just log in and look at the OKRs. And not only that, it's the weekly check-ins or the bi-weekly check-ins that is in there.
Anything unique to finance professionals in particular or to the finance team?
So finance team, I think when we first started, so you talk about more basic stuff, right? About, for example, let's close the account by T plus whatever, 14 days, right? So that's probably but once you get into that cadence, that shouldn't form part of your OKRs anymore. There should be a BAU, right? Then you go on into perhaps, let's say, tax filings. Okay. Then you would like to move on to value accretive stuff, cost savings, perhaps treasury functions. How do we maximize our cash at bank? Where do we go for the greatest yield and at the same time risk that is acceptable to us? So these are all maybe some of the OKRs that you can actually place on the finance team, obviously with the alignment to the overall OKR of the company.
Thanks for breaking that down and really emphasizing the fact that I think for startups with the 1,000 things that have to be juggled, I think prioritization is really important and choosing what metrics to focus on at any particular point in time. I wanted to talk about one specific function of the finance team in most cases, which is fundraising. And this is more of, I guess, like an advice question for entrepreneurs listening in this particular market. Is like, how do you discern between the different types of instruments to raise? Especially now there's more demand for tighter capital, as you mentioned earlier. So how do you discern between raising equity, debt, a mix of both, and perhaps other instruments? I know we've heard a lot about venture debt and all these kinds of other things that you can creatively fundraise with.
So I think I'll just start by saying that every instrument, they obviously carry different characteristics, different pros and cons to the company. They may not always be readily available to everyone. So if you are lucky enough to be able to decide, then the diversification of funding sources is definitely great. For example, at Rainforest, given the nature of our business, we have been able to use some debt. And using debt is great if you use it in a more disciplined manner, because taking that can allow you to grow and minimizing your dilution. But at the same time, we just need to make sure that our cash flows are able to cover the future payments, right? So that's probably one of an example. I think there are also a lot in between, anything from equity to debt. And if you look at the current market situation, a lot of discussions are probably tilted towards more of, even at the early stage, it's moving all more towards a convert notes, for example, or a safe note. To me, this is just a reflection of the current market environment. and also trying to match between the demand and supply of the funds. So I'm not sure if I've fully answered your question, but if you are one of those that will be able to use that, my advice is to use it in a very disciplined manner, ensure that your cash flows will be more than able to cover the future things.
This next question really comes in full circle with what we were talking about at the beginning of this conversation, which is your leap into the startup world from banking. What's your top one line advice for finance professionals looking to jump into startups and become a finance leader?
Yeah, I think before I drop my one line, so to speak, just want to share that very interesting that if you speak to people in the industry for the past couple of years, probably one of the top skill set that people are looking for is that the ability for the CFO to do fundraising, right? Recently, it has moved from fundraising to fundraising plus control. Even I've met people with like 560 strong controls, right? So I think this is the shift. And then this goes to my one liner. I think the role of a finance leader is ever evolving yet critical, right? So if you do join a startup, be ready to be agile, adaptable, and I think more importantly, embrace the multiple hats that you'll be wearing.
Definitely those go beyond finance in certain cases if you join as early as Jason has into some of these companies like employee number 10, even the founding member. And on the note of controls, I wanted to go into our Minute Masterclass corner, which is a new corner for this season of the show. If you were to give a class to fellow entrepreneurs, founders, finance leaders, specifically on measuring financial health or even managing that, which goes to controls, right? What would be the key takeaway for the class?
I've always mentioned this, cash is always king. There is no better measure of financial health of a company than cash, right? Open the bank statement, compare between two time periods, find the movements. That's it. I think the other benefit of tracking cash or using cash as the main matrix is that, as I've already mentioned, it is very easy to track and it's very easy to reconcile. So yes, I think focus on cash, and that is actually the truest form of your financial health.
I had a follow-up question there. And have you seen any like pitfalls in terms of how people interpret? Because you say it's very easy to measure, but then how do they interpret that cash flow into sort of just strategic decisions, right? Because normally people would maybe sometimes overestimate how much they're able to do or underestimate like what's the fine line there. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that increasingly you realize that even if, let's say, as I said, because the previous question was on fundraising, if you go to a bank, for example, right, the line that the bankers will be most interested in would be your cash flow. And to track whether your cash flow, they have tons of metrics out there. One example will be your cash conversion cycle, your cash cover, and the SCR, and so on and so forth. So there are many of these ratios out there that can indicate, I would say, the truer sense of the financial health.
And I would like to go into our rapid fire round corner now, which should be the more fun corner. We can take a little bit of a breather from all the serious talk that we've just done. Just short and sweet answers will do. And the first question is, what superpower of any one of your co-founders, JJ or Ola, would you want to have?
So I have 100 teammates in 15 countries, teleporting power.
I'm not sure if JJ or Ola have that, but yeah, definitely a useful superpower to have. What digital technology or innovation excites you the most today?
AR, the virtual brain that can actually talk to you and serve you.
If you were invited to produce a Netflix or any OT series, what would be the title of the show?
Okay, I do not know much about the title of the show, but I will invite professional athletes from different sports, and they need to learn another sports that they have not played before.
Oh, interesting.
And yeah.
Nice, nice. Yeah, I think that would be a pretty interesting show. Looking back now, what is a skill could be
Probably you can call it unlearn.
unlearned? Not bad. Yeah, I think I'll put that in my list of things to pitch to a Netflix exec if I ever come across one. Looking back now, what is a skill could be a soft skill or hard skill you believe you should have learned back in your time as a student?
Probably I should listen more.
Yeah, and I mean that's really hard to teach as well. If there is something you could automate in your job, you mentioned teleporting already. If you could automate in your job just by wishing for it, what aspect of your role would that be?
Reconciliation. My team takes so much time and effort in reconciling every line. So if I have this magic button that I can help them to automate, that would be awesome.
Yeah, maybe some AI integrations could help do that eventually. I don't really see it as something that's really out of this world, maybe in the next few years. If you could pick anyone alive or dead to be your 24/7 executive coach, who would it be? And briefly, why?
This is an interesting one. I would pick Roger Federer. you look at his history, he's obviously, to me, the greatest of all time.
Right.
And he didn't start playing tennis, although his mom was a tennis coach. He only
Mm.
picked up tennis in his teenager years. And
Right.
this is it's quite unheard of. You take Tiger Woods, for example. He picked up
Right.
his
You really want to start early.
Yeah,
Right.
1 or 2, right? And he's able to build his career to be the greatest of all time. And by the way, he's also an astute investor. I invested in a sports apparel brand called On. Today's worth more than $300 million. So amazing.
Maybe you should get Roger Federer to be in your acquisitions team. And yeah, actually, like I had a follow-up question. What in your Netflix show where the athletes learn other sports, like what other sport would you want Roger Federer to learn if he were part of the show?
I think football will be interesting.
Okay, yeah. Use a different set of
Yeah.
limbs. What is your favorite go-to destination in Southeast Asia apart from, is you're in Singapore now, apart from Singapore? Or what trip are you most looking forward to taking in the region?
So I've recently visited Hanoi in Thailand for
Right.
fun, and I fell in love with the place. So that's one of the places that I would like to go back again.
Yeah, definitely hasn't been mentioned on the show before. Yeah. Congratulations on giving a new destination. What's your favorite activity to de-stress?
Running.
And finally, anything that you've read or taken up recently that you'd like to recommend to our listeners?
Yeah, I think I read this book probably about 2 years ago, Range by David Epstein. I think a lot of interesting points there I could recall. I think one of them is differentiating generalists versus specialists. And through multiple researches on professional athletes, for example. By the way, that's how I learned about Roger Federer as well.
Okay.
That a generalist with a wide range of skill set is more likely to succeed as compared to a specialist.
And I think that really is has been a theme for our conversation today, of finance leaders, very much specialists in the field, like yourself, coming from banking and having to learn to be really a generalist and wearing all these different hats and learning new skills as you help grow these different companies. And now at Rainforest, growing not just Rainforest, but also the brands that you've acquired. On that note, thank you so much, Jason, for coming on the show. Really interesting discussion, and always, I guess in some ways, refreshing to have a finance leader on the show with a very different perspective as well, and had fun going through all these different points and insights with you. Thanks for coming on.
Thank you for having me.